Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Data Playbook. Now that we have a Sunday morning game done and reviewed, go check out the other video for that one. I'm going to step through the 1 o'clock games, starting with Houston at Baltimore. So, looking at the team panel of Houston at Baltimore, you have the money line favoring Houston slightly, and that's because Lamar's out, and we'll take a closer look at that here. You have the spread at 1.5 points and a total point line of 40.5 points. For Houston's ranking, their passing rank is 22, as well as their rushing rank. Their allowed passing rank is 9, and their allowed rushing rank is 13. Baltimore, their passing rank is 12, their rushing rank is 9, their allowed passing rank is 29, and their allowed rushing rank is 27. So Baltimore is a little above average offensively, but below average defensively. Going through the averages, Houston gets 208 passing yards per game and 103 rushing yards per game, while Baltimore gets 230 passing yards per game and averages 133 rushing yards per game. Houston's had 3 interceptions, averaging just less than 1 interception per game, and on average they suffer 2.5 sacks per game. Baltimore's only had 1 interception all season and suffers 3.75 sacks per a game. Defensively, Houston allows 197.5 passing yards per game and allows 102.2 rushing yards per game. Baltimore allows 271 passing yards per game and 141 rushing yards per game. You get on average 6 QB hits from Houston per game, and Baltimore a little behind that with 5.25 QB hits per game. Houston's defense has had a couple interceptions, while Baltimore's only had 1 interception this season. Baltimore only gets about 1 sack per game, while Houston gets 2.75, almost 3 sacks per game. So for the quarterbacks, you have C.J. Stroud for Houston, and Lamar Jackson, who's listed as out right now for me, and Cooper Rush would be your backup. Cooper Rush has no data, so I figure there was no reason to bring him up. And if there's any reason that Lamar Jackson actually happens to make it into the game, you have his data here if you need to refer to it. I'm not going to walk through it like I normally do, but it's still up here in the video if anybody were to need it. So if we start through the fantasy points, you have 52.5 fantasy points for CJ Stroud on the season, averaging 13.1 per game. Lamar Jackson has 93.4 fantasy points on the season, averaging 23.3 fantasy points per game. Stroud's had 3 interceptions this season and has suffered 10 sacks. Lamar has had 1 interception and suffered 15 sacks and has lost a fumble. Stroud has 208 passing yards on average per game this season. CJ Stroud has 208 passing yards per game on average this season and averages 23 rushing yards per game, with his best week last week at 233 passing yards and his worst week at 188. Other than that, he's been averaging over 200 passing yards per game. Going through the running backs, you have Nick Chubb listed as the starter for Houston and Derrick Henry for Baltimore. Nick Chubb with 29.4 fantasy points, 36.4 PPR this season, averaging 7.3 fantasy points and 9.1 in PPR formats. Derrick Henry has 46 fantasy points this season, 50 with PPR formats, averaging 11.5 per game, 12.5 in PPR. Neither of them have any turnovers, so if we look at their averages, you have Chubb averaging 47 rushing yards per game and almost 12 receiving yards per game. Derrick Henry actually has passing stats after that last game, but if we just look at the rushing, 71 rushing yards per game, and the receiving, which is 9 yards per game on average. Of course, that first week with Derrick Henry being the best with 169 rushing yards, but since then he has barely cracked 50 in week 2. That's where he got his best week otherwise. Nick Chubb has much more been closer to an average about 40, 45, maybe 50, much less deviation in his rushing yards. Going through the number 1 receivers, you have Nico Collins on Houston, Zay Flowers on Baltimore. Nico Collins gets 36 fantasy points total this season, 54 PPR, averaging 9 fantasy points, 13.5 in PPR formats. Zay Flowers has 37.7 total fantasy points, 60.7 in PPR, 9.4 fantasy points on average per game, and 15.1 in PPR. Nico Collins has had 1 turnover, while Zay has had none. On average, you get 65 receiving yards per game from Nico Collins, and on average, you get 76.25 from Zay Flowers. Nico's best week was 104 in week 2. His worst week was week 1 with only 25. With all that, he still has the largest share on his team. And similar with Zay Flowers still having the largest share, not by much, but just barely, with his best week being his first week with 143 receiving yards, and his worst week in week 3 with 13 receiving yards. And lastly for this game, you have the tight ends with Dalton Schultz on Houston and Mark Andrews on Baltimore. Dalton Schultz has 12.6 fantasy points, 28.6 total for PPR, averaging 3.1 and 7.1 for PPR. Mark Andrews has 25 fantasy points, 40 PPR, averaging 6.25 fantasy points per game. That's 10 in PPR. Neither of them have any turnovers. And looking at their breakdown, you have Schultz averaging 31.5 receiving yards per game, while Andrews averages 32 per game, so almost exactly the same. Schultz has been averaging really close to that 30 receiving yards per game, as we saw 31 there, but it's very consistent, 28, 29, 39, 30. Mark Andrews has had a couple better weeks in his first couple weeks, with his worst week in week 2 with 2, week 1 with 5, but week 3 was his best week with 91, and last week he had 30. So there's your Houston at Baltimore review. Let's look at Miami at Carolina next. So looking at the details of Miami at Carolina, you have Miami favored on the money line, but not by much, with a spread of 1.5 and a total point line of 45.5 points. So like some of the other teams we've seen, you have Miami with both a passing and rushing rank of 26, being pretty low down there, an allowed passing rank of 21, and an allowed rushing rank of 30. So overall, this would indicate a pretty bad team in the NFL, much lower than average. Carolina has a passing rank of 23 and a rushing rank of 25, also pretty low, but they have an allowed passing rank of 10 and allowed rushing rank of 23. That comes out to be 196 passing yards per game for Miami and 98 rushing yards per game, while Carolina has 202 passing yards per game and 100 rushing yards per game. Miami averages 1 passing interception per game, meaning they've had 4 so far, and on average they suffer 2 sacks per game. Carolina has had a total of 3 passing interceptions, averaging a little less than 1 passing interception per game, and they only average 1.5 sacks suffered per game. Defensively, you have Miami with 235 allowed passing yards per game on average, and 158 allowed rushing yards per game. You have Carolina just above 200 allowed passing yards per game, and they allow 129 rushing yards per game. Both these teams average just a little bit around 2 QB hits per game. Defensively, Carolina gets 1 interception per game, while Miami has had none this year. But Miami does average 2 defensive sacks per game, while Carolina averages less than 1. Walking through the quarterbacks, you have Tua for Miami and Bryce Young for Carolina. Tua's had 52.4 fantasy points total this season. That gives him an average of 13.1 per game. You have Bryce Young with 51.4 fantasy points total this year, which gives him an average of 12.8 fantasy points per game. Tua's had 4 interceptions, had 1 sack fumble loss, had a couple rushing fumbles but did not lose them, so it gives him a total of 5 turnovers, with 8 sacks suffered. Bryce Young has 3 passing interceptions, 1 sack fumble lost, and 1 rushing fumble lost, also giving him 5 turnovers this season. He's only had 6 sacks suffered though this season. Looking at their averages, you have 188 average passing yards per game for Tua, and he only averages about 5 rushing yards per game. Bryce Young averages 188 passing yards per game, with about 13 rushing yards per game. Bryce Young has been averaging about that 150 mark, except for his second week where he hit 328 passing yards. And Tua is actually very much similar, where he hit 315 in the second week. But his first week was with 114 passing yards. And similarly, Bryce Young's worst week was 121 passing yards. And going through the running backs, you have Devon Achane for Miami, and you have Rico for Carolina, since it looks like Chuba Hubbard's hurt. For Achane, you have 56.9 fantasy points, 75.9 PPR, which averages to 14.2 fantasy points and almost 19 PPR. Now, Rico has had some actual fantasy points. He's had 16.3 total and 21.3 in PPR. If we look at those averages, we have 61.5 average rushing yards from Achane and 35.7 receiving yards on average per game. Rico's only had about 20 rushing yards per game and about 5 receiving yards per game. I believe that's because he's been the backup and they've been rotating him in. He's had a couple weeks with 30, before that much less, but it looks like he'll get his starting spot this week, so we'll see how he does. With Achane, though, you have 99 rushing yards as his highest last week, with 30 as his lowest in week 2. And looking at the number 1 receivers for this game, you have Jalen Waddle because you have Tyreek Hill out right now. So you have Waddle as the number one receiver for Miami. And over here you have Territora McMillan, I believe is how you say his name. I'll just say McMillan. But he's also the number one listed wide receiver right now with David Moore on injured reserve. But he's your number one wide receiver with some other people out like David Moore. Looking at their fantasy, you have 30.5 fantasy points for Jalen Waddle, 47.5 in PPR. That's an average of 7.6 fantasy points, 11.8 in PPR. With McMillan, you have 27.8 fantasy points, 45.8 in PPR. That almost averages out to 7 fantasy points per game, almost 11.5 in PPR. Neither of these guys have had any turnovers. So if we look at their averages, Waddle gets 46.2 receiving yards per game. McMillan gets 69.5 receiving yards per game. Looking at it week by week, Waddle stayed pretty consistent. He is definitely the second highest receiver on the team. That's behind Tyreek here. With McMillan, he actually is the largest share receiver here, so maybe he just got promoted up from some injuries. His receiving yards have been 68, 100 as his top number, 48 as his lowest, and then 62 last week. And then just quickly to bring up the tight ends, you have Darren Waller with Miami, and it looks like Tommy Tremble, since you'll have Trevon. And it looks like you have Tommy Tremble because you have Jatravion Sanders out right now. Not much of them have anything worth noting. Waller's only been in one game, so he's had 14.7 in that one game, 17.7 in PPR, whereas Tommy's had an average of 3.5 fantasy points, 6.2 in PPR, so not much there for a tight end. Neither of them have had turnovers. Darren Waller's only had 27 receiving yards this season in one game. Tommy Tremble averages 20 receiving yards per game, with his worst in the first week of getting 2 yards, his best last week getting 42 and a touchdown. And that's all we have for this game. I'll just jump right into the next one. And I think instead of wasting time and going back to the schedule, we'll just jump right into the next one. And jumping in right into our next matchup, we have Vegas at Indianapolis with a money line that favors the Colts pretty heavily, a spread of 7 points, and a total point line of 47.5. For their rankings, the Raiders have a passing rank of 8, a rushing rank of 14, an allowed passing rank of 23, an allowed rushing rank of 14. The Colts have a passing rank of 2, a rushing rank of 8, an allowed passing rank of 22, an allowed rushing rank of 10. So the Colts have a pretty good offense, not as good in the passing defense, but still a pretty good rushing defense. The Raiders have a pretty good passing offense, and everything's about the middle or below average. Going through our team averages, you have 237 passing yards on average per game for the Raiders, and you have an average of 114 rushing yards. The Raiders have averaged almost 2 interceptions per game, 1.75. If we look, that comes out to 7 total for the season. And on average, they suffer 3 sacks per game. The Colts average 269.5 passing yards per game, and they average 136 rushing yards per game. They do average about half an interception per game, so they've had a total of 2 on the season. And they, on average, suffer 1 sack per game. Looking at the defense, the Raiders allow 237 passing yards on average per game, and on average they allow 102.75 rushing yards per game. The Colts average 236.5 allowed passing yards per game, but only allow 96 rushing yards per game. The Colts average slightly higher QB hits with 5.5 over the Raiders' 4.25 per game, and on average the Colts get 1 interception per game, where the Raiders only get half interception per game. They've had 2 total this season, whereas the Colts have had 4. Here we have the quarterback matchup with Geno Smith on the Raiders and Daniel Jones on the Colts. Geno Smith has had 56.5 fantasy points this year, averaging 14.1 per game. Daniel Jones has had 78.5 fantasy points this year, averaging almost 20 fantasy points per game. Geno Smith has had 7 passing interceptions and suffered 12 sacks this season. Daniel Jones has had 2 interceptions and suffered 4 sacks this season. Looking through our averages, you have Geno Smith with 237 passing yards on average per game, and he averages 16.5 rushing yards per game. Daniel Jones gets 269 passing yards per game and averages about 13 rushing yards per game. Week by week, Geno Smith's worst week was last week with 117 passing yards. His best week was week 1 with 362 passing yards. Daniel Jones, his best week was week 2 with 316 passing yards. And his worst week was week 3 with 228 passing yards. Getting into the running backs, you have Ashton Jeanty for Vegas and Jonathan Taylor for the Colts. Jeanty has 52.2 fantasy points, 59.2 in PPR total, averaging 13 fantasy points per game, 14.8 in PPR. Jonathan Taylor has 76.7 fantasy points, 89.7 in PPR. That averages to almost 19 fantasy points per game, 22.4 in PPR. All you have is one rushing fumble loss from Genty, but none from Jonathan Taylor. Looking at their averages, you have Genty with 70.5 rushing yards on average, and it averages only 5 receiving yards per game, while Jonathan Taylor averages 103.5 rushing yards per game and almost 28 receiving yards per game. Jonathan Taylor's best game was week 2 with 165 rushing yards. His worst week was week 1 with 71 rushing yards. Genty, on the other hand, his best week was last week with 138 rushing yards, and his worst week was week 1 with 38 rushing yards. And quickly looking at the number 1 wide receivers, you have Jacoby Myers for Vegas and Michael Pittman for Indianapolis. Myers has 25.8 fantasy points, 46.8 in PPR, averaging 6.5 fantasy points, 11.7 in PPR. Pittman has had 41.4 fantasy points, 62.4 in PPR. That average comes out to be 10.3 or 15.6 in PPR. Neither of them have lost any turnovers. On average, Myers gets 65.5 receiving yards per game. Pittman gets 58.5 receiving yards per game. Looking at them week by week, you have Myers with 97 as his best week in week 1. His worst week was last week with only 30. Pittman either gets about 80 receiving yards or about 40 through his 4 weeks. That does give Pittman about the largest share, not by much, but just barely the largest share of the team. And same with Myers over here with 28%, with his closest competitor at 23%. The tight ends in this game are Brock Bowers for Vegas and Tyler Warden for Indianapolis. Bowers has had 24.5 fantasy points this year, 43.5 in PPR. That average comes out to 6.1, 10.8 in PPR formats. Warren's had 32.9 fantasy points, 51.9 in PPR. This comes out to 8.2 average per game and almost 13 in PPR formats. Neither of them have had any turnovers. And if we look at their averages, Brock Bowers averages 56.2 receiving yards per game, and Tyler Warren averages 65.7 receiving yards per game. Brock Bowers has had his best week in week 1 with 103 receiving yards. Since then, he hasn't broken 50 receiving yards, whereas Tyler Warren averages really close to that mid-70 range. Worst week was 38, but otherwise they've all been about that mid-70 range. They do get some decent share of both their teams. Not the largest, of course, but more than other tight ends typically get. And the next game to go over is the Giants at New Orleans. Here you have a money line favoring the Saints, but just barely. And this is reflected in the spread of 1.5 points and a total line of 42.5. The Giants have a passing rank of 16 and a rushing rank of 16. They have a allowed passing rank of 25 and a allowed rushing rank of 29. So they do fall below average of the entire NFL in their defense. Over here with New Orleans, you have a passing rank of 27, a rushing rank of 11, an allowed passing rank of 15, and an allowed rushing rank of 18. Going through the averages, the Giants have 224 passing yards per game, and they average 112 rushing yards per game. They've had 3 passing interceptions, averaging a little less than 1 per game, and they suffer a little over 3 sacks per game. Over here on New Orleans, you average 191 passing yards per game and 124 rushing yards per game. They've thrown 2 interceptions, averaging half an interception per game, and they suffered a little over 2 sacks per game. Defensively, the Giants allow 255 average passing yards per game, and they on average allow 153 rushing yards per game, which makes them one of the worst in the leagues. The Saints allow 221 average passing yards per game, and on average allow almost 119 rushing yards per game. The Giants get more QB hits with 7.75 per game over the 5 from New Orleans. The Saints have had only 1 interception, while the Giants have had 3, and they average 2.2 defensive sacks per game, whereas New Orleans averages 2.75 defensive sacks per game. For our quarterback comparison, you have Jackson Dart starting for the Giants right now over Russell Wilson, and you have Spencer Rattler for New Orleans. Jason Dart has had 3 games. In those 3 games, he's had almost 20 fantasy points total, averaging only 6.6 per game. Rattler has had 58.8 fantasy points, averaging 14.7 per game. Jackson Dart has had no interceptions and suffered 5 sacks, whereas Rattler has had 1 interception and suffered 9 sacks. Right now, since Jackson Dart is listed technically in these first 2 games, the averages come out. So the average here is 37, but really, since it's been 1 game, it should be 111. But he wasn't listed in week 1, but he was listed week 2, week 3, so those count towards his averages, unfortunately. Same probably goes for rushing yards. Let's take a look at this. Yeah, and similar goes for rushing yards. So that's why he's had a carry. That's why he's listed in those first two games, because he's had a carry each of those games. And then he actually had several more when he played with 54 rushing yards. So in the end, his average really should be 54, even though it's considering these other 2 weeks if we look at the averages. Over here with Rattler, you average 191 passing yards per game. He averages 25 rushing yards per game. And he's even had one target for a reception. Looking down, we saw Jason Dart's 1 week with 111 passing yards. I believe Russell Wilson also played part of that game, so that's an incomplete game for him. Over here, you have the worst week for Rattler at 126 last week, and the best week at 218, but that's where about all the other weeks average out, is about that low 200 number. And taking a look at the running backs, you have Cam Scalaboo for the Giants and Alvin Kamara for New Orleans. Cam has had 41.9 fantasy points, 53.9 in PPR, averaging 10.5 fantasy points, 13.5 in PPR. Alvin Kamara has had 34.5 fantasy points, 47.5 in PPR. That averages 8.6 fantasy points, 11.8, almost 11.9 in PPR formats. Cam has had no turnovers, but Alvin has had one receiving fumble. And if we look at the averages, Cam averages 42 rushing yards per game and almost 25 receiving yards per game. Alvin Kamara averages 64 rushing yards per game and 12 receiving yards per game. Week by week, other than Cam's first week with -3 rushing yards, which is probably pulling down his average, he's had his best week with 79 last week, and he's continued to get better. With Kamara, his best week was week 2 with 99, almost 100 rushing yards. Last week was his second best week with 70, and other than that, he's hit 40 for the other 2 weeks. And if we go through the number 1 wide receivers, you have Wan'Dale Robinson and Chris Olave. For Robinson on the Giants, he has 29.7 total fantasy points, 47.7 in PPR. That averages out to 7.4 fantasy points and almost 12 in PPR formats. For Chris Olave, he's had 22.5 fantasy points, 48.5 in PPR. That averages out to 5.6 fantasy points and a little over 12 in PPR. They've had no turnovers except for that Chris Olave has had a passing interception. He's had one attempt and threw an interception on that one attempt. But if we look at the averages for the receiving, you have Robinson with 59 average receiving yards, and with Olave, you average 46 receiving yards per game. Robinson had that one big week with 142 receiving yards, but otherwise kind of quiet with 26 and 14 over the last 2 weeks. He doesn't quite own the largest share of the team, but that's because Malik Neighbors owns that large share right there, and he is out. Over here with Chris Olave, you have a much more consistent 50, mid-50 range every week, except for last week where he only got 20. This does give him the largest share of his team's receiving yards, with almost a third of the share. And finally, looking at our tight ends, you have Theo Johnson for the Giants right now, and you have Juwan Johnson for New Orleans. Right now, he's listed as questionable, but so is every other tight end that New Orleans has. So we'll just look at him. Theo has had 12.6 total fantasy points, 21.6 in PPR. That averages to 3 fantasy points and 5.4 in PPR. Juwan Johnson has had 26.4 fantasy points and 48.4 in PPR. That averages to 6.6 fantasy points and 12.1 in PPR. Neither of them have had any turnovers, and neither of them have had any turnovers. If we look at the average, Theo Johnson only gets 16.5 receiving yards on average, but Juwan Johnson gets about 51 receiving yards on average. And if we look at that breakdown, the best week Theo's had is week 2 with 34 yards, otherwise it's been pretty low. For Juwan Johnson, his best week was week 1 with 76. His worst week was last week with 28. This still gives him a pretty decent size share. I think it's the third largest share of the team's receiving yards. But Theo Johnson can't say the same for his team, with a much smaller share of receiving yards compared to his teammates. And going through our next matchup, you have Dallas in New York. The money line favors Dallas with a spread of 1.5 and a total line of 47.5. Dallas is the number 1 passing team and has a rushing rank of 12. On the other end, though, they're the worst team at stopping the pass and have an allowed rushing rank of 20. The Jets are one of the worst teams for passing, but one of the best rushing teams. They're the 12th best, and their allowed passing rank is 12, and their allowed rushing rank is 25. So on average, the Cowboys get 290 passing yards per game, and they average 123 rushing yards per game. They've had 1 interception on average per game, so 4 interceptions total this season, and they suffer 1.5 sacks per game. With the Jets, you have 181 passing yards on average per game, and 144 rushing yards per game. They've had 1 interception this whole season, and they averaged 2.7 sacks suffered per game. Looking at the defense, Dallas has allowed 309 average passing yards per game, and they allow 123 average rushing yards per game. The Jets allow 208 average passing yards per game and 130 average rushing yards per game. Dallas has slightly better QB hits on average with 4 over 2.75 on the Jets. No interceptions for the Jets this season, but the Cowboys have had 1 defensive interception, and they both average about 1 defensive sack per game. Going through our quarterback breakdown, you have Dak Prescott for the Cowboys and Justin Fields for the Jets. Dak's had 73 fantasy points this season, averaging 18.2 per game. Justin Fields has had 60 fantasy points this season, averaging 20 per game. Dak's had 3 interceptions and suffered 6 sacks, while Justin Fields has had no interceptions and suffered 5 sacks. He has lost a sack fumble and a rushing fumble, so he still has 2 turnovers total. Going through the averages, you have 279 average passing yards for Dak, an average of 5 rushing yards per game. Justin Fields has averaged 157 passing yards per game, and that's primarily because of his second week where he went out early and only got 27 passing yards. But he does average 59.3 rushing yards per game. So breaking it down, as we saw, Justin Fields' worst week was his second week with 27 passing yards, but that's when he got hurt. So maybe this should be taken out as an outlier, which shouldn't count towards the other averages, because otherwise he'd be around that 220 range. For Dak, his worst week was his first week with 188 passing yards, and since then he's at 361, 251, and 319. So Dak might have the best numbers out there so far of any quarterback this season. Looking at our running backs for this game, you have Javonte Williams on Dallas and Breece Hall on the Jets. Williams has had 60.6 fantasy points, 76.6 in PPR, averaging 15 fantasy points per game or 19 in PPR. Breece Hall has had 34.6 fantasy points, 47.6 in PPR. He's averaged 8.6 fantasy points, 11.9 in PPR. Breece Hall has had no turnovers, but Javonte Williams has had 1 rushing fumble lost. Our averages are 78 average rushing yards per game for Javonte Williams, and he averages almost 20 receiving yards per game. Breece Hall averages 59.5 rushing yards per game and 27 receiving yards per game. Week by week, Javonte Williams, his best week was in week 2 with 97, worst week in week 1 with 54. Breece Hall's best week was 107 rushing yards in week 1. His worst week was week 3 with 21, and last week he had 81. So, looking at our number 1 wide receivers, we have George Pickens here for Dallas because it looks like CeeDee Lamb is out, and you have Garrett Wilson for the Jets. Pickens has had 54 fantasy points this season, 75 in PPR, averaging 13.5, 18.75 in PPR formats. Garrett Wilson has had 49.1 fantasy points, 76.1 in PPR, averaging 12.3 fantasy points per game, 19 in PPR. Neither of them have actually lost any turnovers, even though Garrett Wilson's had a fumble. It was managed to be recovered by the Jets. Looking at their averages, you get George Pickens with an average of 75 receiving yards per game, and Garrett Wilson, you get 77.75 receiving yards per game. Garrett Wilson has had a pretty strong average around that 80 mark, 95 being his best week in week 1, his worst week with 50. He owns the largest share of his team by far as well here with a 46.3%. Pickens has had his worst week with his first week at 30 and his best week last week with 134 receiving yards and 68 both weeks in between. This does give him a pretty good share. It is actually the largest share of the team, probably over CeeDee Lamb here. But since he's out, he's losing his percentage to George Pickens. And once again, ending with the tight ends, you have Jake Ferguson for Dallas and Mason Taylor for the Jets. Ferguson's had 28.3 fantasy points, 62.3 in PPR, averaging 7 fantasy points or 15.5 in PPR formats. Mason Taylor's had 10.8 fantasy points, 21.8 in PPR. This averages 2.7 fantasy points or 5.5 in PPR formats. Neither of them have any turnovers. If we look at their averages, you have Jake Ferguson averaging 55.75 receiving yards per game, and Mason Taylor only averaging 27 receiving yards per game. His best week was last week with 65 receiving yards, his worst week with week 2 with only 5. So this still does give him a decent share compared to some of the other receivers that have a share of the receiving yards. With Ferguson, his best week was week 3 with 82 receiving yards. His worst week was week 1 with 23 receiving yards. So he's been a little bit more inconsistent over the map. This still gives him about a 12.5% share of the team's receiving yards. And going through our last 1 o'clock matchup, you have Denver at Philadelphia, with the money line favoring Philadelphia and a spread of 4.5 points, with a total line of 43.5. Going through their rankings, Denver has a passing rank of 18, a rushing rank of 5, an allowed passing rank of 13, and an allowed rushing rank of 12. Philly is the worst team in the league for passing, with a passing rank of 32, a rushing rank of 15, an allowed passing rank of 14, and an allowed rushing rank of 21. Going through the team averages, you have 215 average passing yards per game for Denver, and they average 143 rushing yards per game. They do average 1 interception per game, meaning that they have 4 total this season, but they average less than 1 sack suffered per game, which I think might be the best in the league. Over here with Philadelphia, you average 152 passing yards per game, and 113 rushing yards per game, and 113 rushing yards per game. They've had no interceptions, but do suffer 2.2 sacks on average per game. Looking at the defense, Denver has allowed 213 passing yards on average, and less than 100 rushing yards on average per game. Philadelphia allows 215 passing yards on average per game, and 126 rushing yards per game. Denver dominates the QB hits with 10 on average per game, over Philly's almost 5, less than 5 QB hits per game. However, Philadelphia has had 3 interceptions this season, whereas Denver's defense has only had 1 interception. But Denver's defense does average 3.75 defensive sacks per game, whereas Philly only gets about 1.25. Looking at the quarterbacks in this game, you have Bo Nix for Denver and Jalen Hurts for the Philadelphia Eagles. Bo has had 66.2 fantasy points this season, averaging 16.5. Jalen Hurts has had 84.3 fantasy points this season, averaging 21 fantasy points per game. Bo Nix has had 4 passing interceptions and suffered 3 sacks this season. He's also had a sack fumble loss, so he's had a total of 5 turnovers. Jalen Hurts has had no interceptions, suffered 9 sacks this season, has lost a fumble in a sack, but not a rushing fumble, had 2 sack fumbles though, and recovered 1 of them. So he comes out with a total of just 1 turnover this season. Going through the averages, you have 215 average passing yards per game for Bo Nix. He averages 20 rushing yards per game. Jalen Hurts has had 152 average passing yards per game, but he averages almost 45 rushing yards per game. Week by week, Jalen Hurts has not even broken 152 except for 1 week, his best week with 226. Otherwise, it's all been about 150 or lower. Bo Nix, meanwhile, is a little bit more inconsistent with 176, 206, 153, and then 326 last week. Looking through our running backs, you have J.K. Dobbins for Denver and Saquon Barkley for Philadelphia. J.K. Dobbins has had 52.1 fantasy points, 57.1 in PPR, averaging 13 fantasy points per game, or 14.3 in PPR. Saquon Barkley has had 48.7 fantasy points, 62.7 in PPR, averaging 12.2 fantasy points, 15.7 in PPR. Neither of them have any turnovers. And if we look at their season averages, you have J.K. Dobbins with 80.75 rushing yards per game, Saquon with only 59 rushing yards per game. Looking at their averages, you have J.K. Dobbins with 80.75 rushing yards per game and averages about 5 receiving yards per game. Saquon gets almost 60 rushing yards per game and averages 17.5 receiving yards per game. Saquon's been averaging pretty low in that 50 range, as we can see with this, about 60, with 1 week with 88 rushing yards as his high. Over here with J.K. Dobbins, you have his high last week of 101 rushing yards, but he's been getting progressively better, where his worst week was 63, and it's just gotten more and more every week. And looking at the number 1 wide receivers, you have Courtland Sutton for Denver and A.J. Brown for Philadelphia. Sutton's had 44.6 fantasy points, 62.6 in PPR, averaging 11.1 fantasy points, 15.65 in PPR. A.J. Brown has 21.1 fantasy points, 35.1 in PPR, averaging 5.28 fantasy points, 8.7 in PPR. Neither player has any turnovers. And if we look at the season averages and week by week, you have Sutton with 66.5 receiving yards, his best coming in week 3 with 118, his worst with week 2 with 6, last week not bad with 81 and a receiving touchdown. A.J. Brown, on the other hand, averages 37.75 receiving yards per game, with his worst weeks both being last week with only 7 and the first week with only 8, his best week with week 3 with 109. And even with all of that, he still owns the largest share of his team, and that's because they have so few receiving yards that most of them still seem to go to A.J. Brown, even though there's so few compared to somebody like Sutton. And on Sutton's side, he gets about 37.5% of the receiving share, so the largest share by far, but not quite as big as A.J. Brown's share. And for our last matchup of the tight ends, you have Evan Ingram on the Broncos and Dallas Goedert on Philadelphia. Ingram has 6.2 fantasy points total, 14.2 in PPR, averaging only 2, and less than 5 in PPR. Goddard has 29.4 fantasy points, 41.4 in PPR, averaging just less than 10 fantasy points, or 13.8 in PPR. Neither of them have lost any fumbles or have any turnovers. So this comes out that Evan Ingram's averages just less than 21 receiving yards per game. He did miss 1 week in there, with his worst week being only 12 receiving yards and his best week only 29, which does give him a pretty small share of the team's receiving yards. For Goddard, you have 38 receiving yards on average per game, with his best being 44 in week 1, but pretty close to that mid-30 range for all the weeks that he's played. And this gives him a similarly small share of the receiving yards, about the same as Evan Ingram's share percentage of the team. So there you have it. There's your review for the 1 o'clock games here on Sunday. I hope that you all enjoyed. I hope that you got something out of it. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you want to see more, and leave a comment on how I can do better. But otherwise, take care, and I will see you guys in the next video.